Hello. If you're watching this, you're probably interested in studying landscape architecture, and specifically at the University of Pretoria. Now, I am Johan Prinsloo. I teach in the Department of Architecture. I'm also a landscape architect, and I'm joined today by an ex-student of ours, Gavin Cook. He's from Land Arc Studios, and we'll get to that a bit later. But I thought of inviting him for an interview to discuss his life as a student and after completing his studies. So, hi, Gavin. Welcome, and thanks for taking out time to what, if I'm looking at the background and all the drawings pinned up there, it seems like you're quite busy at the moment.
Yes, hi, Johan, and welcome to the listeners. Yeah, so we are very busy at the moment, but I think it's important to do things like this and to try and educate, especially those that are interested about landscape architecture, about what it is that we do. So very happy to be here.
Thanks. Because it's interesting. It's, I've been working with students for so many years, and often students who come to study architecture sometimes later only discover landscape architecture as a career option, and that will now in future be possible for people who have studied architecture to come and study landscape architecture, and also from other disciplines. So that's quite exciting. But how did you get to know more about landscape architecture? It's not such a common profession, that people talk about on the school grounds in matric. So what got you interested into landscape architecture in the first place?
Yeah, I think I was almost exactly that person. I obviously knew that architecture existed in the world, and I was interested in it, but it didn't quite sit right for some reason. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time in the garden with my dad, planting vegetables and making benches out of wood from the back of the house and things like that. So I had an interest in building and in gardens, but never just the building. It had to be something that we were building in the garden that we would sit and have lunch at one day underneath the tree. And I didn't know what landscape architecture was, or that it existed, until my matric year, when all of a sudden I had to decide what I was going to do for a living. And luckily, someone that went to my school had just finished studying landscape architecture and was working at a practice in Johannesburg. And I thought, wow, amazing. You can design outdoor spaces and not just buildings. And I then went and job shadowed at this firm and fell in love with this idea of designing outdoor space rather than the building. And from that moment of job shadowing, it was kind of meant to be.
Yeah. Was it at Green Ink that you job shadowed, or where was the
It
firm?
was.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was Green Ink, and James French was the ex-student at my high school
Okay.
that had studied landscape architecture, and his mother was a very strict teacher at the school. I hope he doesn't pass this podcast on to her. She hears this. And I remember creeping into her office one day to ask whether she can put me in touch with James so that I can find out more about what landscape architecture was. So that's how it happened. So it started off as sort of a scary moment, because she was always shouting at me for having my hair too long and things like that. So, but once she learned that I wanted to study what her son had done, then I was her star pupil.
Okay. Sounds only slightly corrupt, but anyway. And he's now, I remember, because he was, when I started teaching, he was one of the first students I had when he was a master's student. And he's now in New Zealand, I believe, working there for WSP or someone. Anyway, so you obviously then fell, as you say, you fell in love with landscape architecture and you started studying. Did you I mean, in South Africa, obviously, there are not that many places one can study landscape architecture. What made you choose the University of Pretoria, which at that time really was the only place one could study landscape architecture as an undergraduate degree? But what made you decide, or was that the reason that it was the only place, or was there other reasons that made you interested in our department?
It was more or less exactly that. As I mentioned before, I knew that I didn't want to be an architect.
Mm.
And if you studied in Cape Town, there was a way to do it. You could study architecture and then postgrad in landscape.
Yeah.
So that option did exist, but it meant becoming an architect first, which I knew I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
So it was the fact that there was a BSc landscape architecture undergrad course in Bokende that made my decision final, that this is what I was going to study, and I wasn't going to change my mind, even though there were some lecturers in Bokende that tried to persuade me
to
to
study
go inside the
architecture.
building.
Well, luckily you didn't listen to them. But I remember, because you then came to first year where I was teaching at that time, and I remember your work to be very sophisticated. Did you have any background in art or design or anything like that? Because usually when students, enter a field of study in a design direction, their initial attempts to design anything are very clumsy, as it should be, and then one grows from there. But you seem to have a sort of a natural bent for design. Did that come from anywhere, or was it just
Not that I know of. I think you're being very kind in remembering my last 2 quarters of first year and beyond, because I remember my first 2 quarters, first half of the first year, being very difficult, and
yeah.
I wasn't very good at it. I remember getting, because I didn't do arts at school, I did very scientific subjects. I did
Yeah.
geography and science and biology, which in hindsight were fantastic for a landscape architect. But I didn't have the artistic side that first year was trying to draw out of the students.
Yeah.
Probably because school was very scientific and boxy. So I had no idea of the ability. And I remember asking in the interview to be selected to study landscape architecture, do I need to be able to draw? Because I don't know if I can draw. And
well, I think
you were
yeah.
Sorry, you were interviewing me and you said, no, you will learn. And I did.
You did indeed. I think that's important for listeners who are interested in studying landscape architecture to note, actually, is that sometimes people think if they can't draw, or if they didn't have art as a subject, or if they're not coming from an undergraduate degree that is in architecture or in the arts, that they can't do landscape architecture. But as you say, drawing and thinking creatively, those are things that can be developed over time. So one mustn't be put off by not having those skills up front. Okay, and the rest of your years, do you have any specific memories of studying in Bokende, as we refer to this building, that you think back to?
I do. I remember my love for building models, which Bokende encouraged, because of the spatial exploration of making space with your hands in 3D form and representing what would be built in the ideal world. So I remember having a blast, and I remember being surrounded by models in studio, not having enough desk space on the drawing board for them all. And that, I think that's really what helped me develop that creative side. Is I wasn't confident in the drawing side, and I didn't think I could draw at that time, but I knew that I could make things. And it was through making models and trying to make space with cardboard and clay and all those things, other than the pen, that probably developed the design side of me as a soon-to-be landscape architect. And for me, that was fantastic, being able to, coming from school where everything is written and you have an exam, to all of a sudden being critiqued on a thing that you've created in the studio that people might not understand, but somehow architects and landscape architects seem to get it. I think, you know, that was amazing for me in undergrad. And then it became more technical and about developing skills and design way of thinking and solving problems. And I think, you know, studying at Bokinder was wonderful for that. It was a whole rounded process that, looking back on it now, I realize it was happening, but at the time I was just doing what felt right, and what I needed to do to express that design.
Now, if you had to warn people, if you had to tell people, give them some insight into the things you think people should know before they pursue a career in landscape architecture, first obviously as a student and then as a practitioner, what aspects do you think of studying landscape architecture or being a landscape architect even are not so great and people should be aware of?
Yeah, I think time. It takes a lot of time to develop yourself and to complete the course to the standard that I wanted to, and that is, you know, that is appreciated in the building, in the architecture department. So coming from school where I played a lot of sport and had a lot of time for sport and played for clubs and school, and to all of a sudden studying landscape architecture becoming a full-time job.
It requires some dedication,
yeah. But then I found joy in that. So if I had been just sitting at a drawing table drawing, I might not have loved it. But, you know, finding the models and other ways of expressing myself in the studio, you're almost allowed to shape your undergrad, especially first year, to what suits you, rather than, you know, being scripted in doing something. So time, and I suppose all of a sudden shifting, especially from school to university, shifting from a prescribed way of learning to now trying to discover yourself as a designer at a very young age.
Because I can imagine the same would be true for people now entering into our new postgrad, where they may be coming from study fields that are more scientifically orientated, you know, where something is either right or wrong, and you're given a textbook and you must just study that thing and cram it into your head and you write a test and that's the end of it. Suddenly coming into an environment where things are not so certain and which very much self-directed, and then one is of course open to criticism, which is usually quite friendly, but it's a process of learning that is quite different from other study fields. And I think if everyone is coming from the art side of things, then it will be different, because there is this scientific component to landscape architecture. Obviously, you can't just plant any plant anywhere. You have to consider the way water flows over a site, how to build things. So there's that more scientific side to things as well. But I must admit that many students over the years have pointed out that it's exactly that balance that they enjoy between, on the one side, being immersed in this artistic process of conceiving ideas and spaces, and then on the other hand, you're still not out of the world of science. You still have to make things work and stand up and grow and so on. But okay, moving on from your studies, You obviously graduated, otherwise you wouldn't have been sitting here in a landscape architectural practice. Um, Tell me about your life after Bokende. What did you do? Where did you go first? Did you work after your, because in the old system where there was the undergrad and then the postgrad, people used to go and work after their third year. And if I'm not mistaken, you went to Green Ink, the very firm that inspired you to become a landscape architect. You worked there for a while.
Yes, exactly. So I finished my 3 years, and it wasn't prescribed. It was sort of encouraged that you
Yeah.
go out. But it was kind of the norm at the time. Everyone did it, and it was good to do before going into postgrad. And I applied everywhere, and was very lucky to go to Green Ink,
Yeah.
which was a fantastic studio. And I walked in the first day, and it was a little bit intimidating because I sat between the two directors and always felt that they were looking over my shoulder at what I was drawing on the screen.
Yeah.
But you soon learn that when you're involved in a project, you're designing for the benefit of the project and to create the best thing collectively as a studio that you can. And you go from being a student and being critiqued on your own projects to all of a sudden having to let go of your ideas and put them into a studio as a collective and crafting a design together. And you have to learn to, in a way, let go of your ideas and not be so personally attached to things.
Mm.
And learn that critique is there to benefit the full project, and it's not to point fingers at you and say you were wrong. So that was my first sort of experience of being in a landscape architecture studio, is that everyone's there and projects exist and they bounce around the studio, and together you craft something that is refined and it's practical and it works, and then you bring in the design side and you create something together that is the best that it can be.
So it's really that process of criticism that we referred to earlier that one experiences as a student that continues into the design office. It's an environment where ideas are shared, pens are taken out. I see there to the back of you on the wall, there are sheets of paper and bumf, which is sort of transparent paper overlaid. And the first design is never the best one, as you said. And then through a process of feedback and co-design, as it's called these days, the project improves. Okay, and then after being at Green Ink, and I think students, especially if you're in South Africa, you'll be well served to go and look at the work that Green Ink does, because I think they're a good firm in our context, and to see what kind of projects they work on. But anyway, after that, you came back and you did your postgrad. Your thesis, that's another interesting thing, because I remember it fondly and I don't want to spend too much time discussing it. But you did a thesis called Reimagining the Urban Ruin, which was about the reuse of an old ruin in Joburg. Did that thesis, what triggered your interest in your thesis?
It's funny now that we're talking about it, because we're kind of condensing all 5 years of studying into one conversation, and perhaps it was this rebel against being an architect and seeing a ruined building in the middle of Johannesburg and trying to think, how do we save this? Yeah. And traditionally you restore it, or you rebuild it, or what tends to happen now is you demolish and redevelop that land. And those are three very architectural approaches to a ruined structure. And being a landscape architecture student, I would drive past this ruin quite often and look into it and see things growing out of the windows and trees now starting to peer over the top of the ruined walls. And I thought, well, it's already becoming a landscape. Can we not reactivate this ruined structure that has become an eyesore in the city? Can we not turn it into a garden and reactivate it through landscape architecture rather than one of the three architectural approaches? So perhaps it was the rebel against being an architect and the traditional architectural approach to ruins and developments. And I have had a love for the city and for green spaces, and slowly over the last 10 years, even with my young eyes, I would notice that green spaces were being neglected, and perhaps because focus was on development and new development in the city and outside of the city. So it was a collage of things that drew me to the site and to the research topic, and eventually to the project. But I suppose it was a love for landscape and trying to use landscape in a non-traditional way.
Obviously, as a student, one is that stage quite idealistic and so on. But your thesis, there are many projects like that all over the world happening, where landscape architects are designing spaces, especially in derelict areas or deindustrialized areas of cities, and that are playing a huge role in regenerating those areas. I can't help but think of a first year project you did where you also worked on a piece of infrastructure. It was a bridge, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, let's not go there. That's too long ago. Now, going after you got your thesis, you got your Masters of Landscape Architecture degree here at the University of Pretoria. Then where did you go? What was your plan? Did you have a plan?
It was in the middle of my master's year where I started thinking about, oh, okay, now I'm going into the real world. What am I going to do? And like you alluded to earlier, you either studied inside Bokende at the University of Pretoria, or you postgraduated at the University of Cape Town. And it's such a small field, landscape architecture in South Africa. Everyone kind of knows each other, and we've all either studied at the same place, or we've studied in a city just down, well, not down the road, but there's only two places that you can study. And I thought, well, everyone kind of is doing the same thing in a way. So we've all had the same teaching. So I wanted to look elsewhere to find out more about what landscape architecture is outside of South Africa. So I applied to many firms, probably around 80 in the UK, and got good feedback on a lot, and ended up having around 4 or 5 interviews with a few different studios, and some being, the work that you do is lovely, please come first and then we'll see if you fit in. But that's a big commitment at the time. But a studio called Farrah Huxley, based in London, offered me a job straight away after a Skype interview.
Wow.
Like this.
You were still in South Africa doing this?
I was still in South Africa, only halfway through my master's. So really what I had presented to them was undergrad and honors work, and some scribblings of my master's dissertation. And that managed to, I suppose, win me the opportunity to go to Farrah in London to join their team. Wow. which was exciting at the time, and I grabbed it with both hands. I finished my master's in December, and packed everything up, and in January I was in London working at Farrah Huxley, which was an eye-opening experience. Like I just mentioned, in South Africa, it's a small field, landscape architecture. We all know each other, and we all have a very similar business and studio model where we do similar types of projects and work, and we work with architects in the same sort of way. And all of a sudden I'm in London, where there's landscape architecture studios with 80 landscape architects rather than 8.
Wow.
And they're doing, projects on the urban design scale, and there's projects in the EU and in the Middle East, and whereas in South Africa we sort of were confined to our borders and jumped into Africa every now and then. So it was a little explosion of landscape architecture to show me how big it was, and really how important it was. There's things in planning, for instance, in London, that you need a landscape architect in order to get approval to develop a block of flats, which is just a building, which is where the architects come in. But in order to get this, a landscape architect needs to have a chance with the pen to design the space around, and to design the spaces for the people that are living in the flat, and how they're going to come out of the front door of that apartment block every day and experience the city and experience the outdoor environment. So it was eye-opening, really.
Yeah, it's incredible when the landscape architect is given the opportunity to be involved with a project from the beginning, because sometimes the landscape architect is left with the sort of leftover bit of the site, and they just need to almost fix it after the developers came in. So it's wonderful when people do work, when landscape architects are involved from the beginning of a project. Now going there, to the big city, leaving your home and everything, that must have been quite intimidating. And I would imagine if I had to do that, I would have been almost concerned or worried whether I'm up to standard. Can I do the work? Going to places like, world cities is often intimidating because one believes that, the standards are just so much better. How did you find entering into that world in terms of being equipped to function there in a big practice like that?
I think before I went, I had the exact same thoughts.
Yeah.
Am I going to be good enough? Am I going to walk in and I'm going to be so junior, or I'm not going to be at the level of the other people in the studio? But when I arrived, it was quite the opposite. I discovered that I had studied for 5 years plus the year in between, so 6 years of just landscape architecture and just developing as a landscape architect, because this is what I wanted to be. And I discovered that when I arrived in the studio, that there were people that had been teachers, for instance, that had then done a bridging course for 2 years to become a landscape architect. So really they had 2 years of training, whereas I had 6. And I noticed that I had tools in my toolbox that they didn't have. So, spatial awareness and proportions of items, of structures in the landscape that seemed to be coming naturally to me from all the practice, that they weren't missing, but they hadn't been trained as landscape architects for the same amount of time. So I found that I was helping out a lot more than what I thought. I thought I was going to be the one running to everyone and asking what I do, but I had a lot of people asking me, advice on things like drawings, for instance, and how to present a drawing, and how to render plans. And we in Boken we had such a vast array of skills that we developed, from hand sketches to rendering on Photoshop, whatever software, that I could kind of do a lot of things that only some things were being done in the studio by certain people. So I felt very equipped after the first month.
Wow. Because as a teacher, one is obviously it's always good to hear that students who go wherever they choose to go, that they can cope, because it at least gives some indication that the standard of the program is comparable to any other place. Now, I want to quickly ask you just about, you obviously then came back to South Africa, and you're now at Landark Studios in Joburg. Tell us a bit about the kind of work that you're busy with, because it sounds quite exciting. You're sort of, almost want to say, like a landscape architectural adventurer from the stories I heard. But what kind of projects are you working on at the moment?
So yeah, at Landark, we're involved in a lot of sort of boutique niche projects that you don't see on landscape architects' websites. So, for instance, we've got a project in the Seychelles, which is a tiny little island that takes 40 minutes to walk around, and it's got a hotel on, and they want to go completely off the grid. And therefore, we need to grow every vegetable and make the salt and grow the pepper and dry the pepper out and dry the salt out to put them in pepper and salt grinders that go on the tables. And we need to grow carrots at certain times when the kitchen's going to need carrots, and tomatoes in summer when they're going to need that. But then also being in the Seychelles, knowing the climate, when it's going to rain, and that when it's too wet, tomatoes won't ripen. So it's an amazing project where what we were speaking about earlier, the science is playing a large role in what the project will be, but at the same time, it being a hotel in the Seychelles, where there's an emphasis on guest experience. We've got to turn this farm into something that when the guests arrive on this island for a week, but there's nothing else around, that they're able to sit in this farm essentially and enjoy it. So you've got to design for the vegetables to grow to a certain standard, but also to create a comfortable environment for guests to sit in this garden and eat the vegetables that are growing just next to them. So it's a wonderful project, and Landark has done projects like that before. Yeah. So we've got that side of the studio. We're also involved in a lot of residential gardens, which in landscape architecture, often gardeners are looked down upon. But while in the UK, after Farah Huxley, I worked at a garden design practice with Ginny Blom, and I discovered a love for garden design, really, and for the smaller scale and the detail and the plant selection, and moving from commercial landscapes to just personal landscapes where you're designing for one or two people and they're your clients. And I brought that love back with me. And when I found Landark as a studio that does the grand things, hotels and urban spaces and the farms, but also does residential projects, it excited me, because I could bring what I had learned with Jenny to South Africa, and I could get stuck in garden design as much as landscape architecture.
So in many ways, you're now back there with your father in the garden. Full circle. Yes. After all these adventures, you've in a way returned to your roots, and where, the thing that started your interest. And it's interesting, we discussed it the other day, in this thing of garden design that is often sort of looked down upon. But I've also, through my own research into history of garden design, rediscovered the value of garden design as an art form, that's comparable to any other art form. But Gavin, it's been wonderful talking to you. I can talk to you for many hours on end about all the exciting things you're doing. But thanks for sharing with us a bit about your life as a student and now as a practitioner. And I'm certainly going to keep an eye on the work you do, and look forward to seeing what Gavin Cook is going to I almost said Cook up next, but I won't. But what Gavin Cook is going to do next as a landscape architect. And I hope that this discussion has helped you, if you're watching this to make up your mind about studying landscape architecture. I hope that this has helped you make your decision. Gavin, thanks a lot.
No problem. Thanks, Johan.
Keep well. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.